In this video, we will introduce content providers setup. Content providers are essentially databases. Usually, an app will include a content provider if it needs to make its data accessible to other apps. All content providers present the same API to apps, regardless of how they were actually implemented internally. Most content providers rely on the SQLite functionality included in Android, but they can also use files or other types of storage. A content provider is a component that makes a specific set of an app's data available to other apps. Content providers are preferable to directly accessing raw data because they decouple component code from raw data formats. This decoupling prevents code breakage when formats change. Let's look at a basic example. Here, I've already created an employees provider which extends the content provider base class. Content providers are one of the primary building blocks of Android applications, providing content to applications. They encapsulate data and provide it to applications through the single content resolver interface. A content provider is only required if you need to share data between multiple applications. Let's take a look at our setup. First, notice that I have a string called provider name. The provider name is the authority. This specifies the name of the content provider, for example, contacts, browser, etc. For third-party content providers, this could be the fully qualified name, such as we have here, com.example.provider.corp. I also have a string called URL, which is composed of a string with the value of content : the provider name that we just specified above, and then / employees. Let's take a look at this content : This is the prefix and is always set to content : The / employees is the data type and indicates the type of data that this particular provider provides. For example, if we're getting all the contacts from the contacts content provider, then the data path would be people and the URI would look like this, except with people at the end. Now here I have content URI, which is of type URI. And what I do is I call the parse method, which parses this URL. So we call the parse method, which parses the given encoded URI string and creates a URI, which we'll be using later on. Remember that Android uses by default the SQLite database engine. SQLite is a lightweight transactional database engine that occupies a small amount of disk storage and memory. So it's perfect choice for creating databases on many mobile operating systems such as Android and iOS. Here I have my string constant _ID. The database tables should use the identifier _ID for the primary key of the table. Several Android functions rely on this standard. ID is useful when you are using the enhanced adapters which make use of a cursor, for example the resource cursor adapter. It's used by these adapters to provide an ID which can be used to refer to the specific row in the table which relates the item in whatever the adapter is being used for. For example, a row in a list view. It's not necessary if you're not going to be using classes which need an _ID column in a cursor. And you can also use as _ID to make another column appear as though it's called _ID in your cursor. I also have my string name constant, which is going to be used with our database logic, and EMP_NUM, which is our employee number constant to be used also with our database logic. I also have an employees projection map. The projection map maps from column names that the caller passes into query to database column names. And we will use these contents with our database logic to toggle between querying for all employees or retrieving a single employee. We'll be using employees and employee ID in a case statement. Now, if we look at the code here, we're using a URI matcher. So we define a URI matcher that will help us decide which action to take for an incoming content URI. For example, if we look at our URI provider name employees matches all employees. Employees with the pound and then the employee ID matches the employee with the provided ID. Now let's take a look at our final piece of code, which is where we add an instance variable of type SQLite database with the name of DB. We also have a string for our database name, which we'll name Corp, a string for our employees table name, name employees, an int to store our database version, and then we'll finally have a string that has our SQL to create our database table. This concludes our discussion of content providers setup.